Growing calls for President Jacob Zuma to step down. The ANC's National Working Committee will meet today to discuss his future. Pro-Zuma protesters are expected to march to the ANC headquarters in a hands-off Jacob Zuma campaign, while a counter group of ANC supporters and members will be having what they call a human chain to stop the pro-Zuma demonstrators. ANC's Thulasizwe Simelane is outside Luthuli House this morning. Good morning once again, Thulasizwe. Let's just start there firstly. Give us a sense of what's happening on the ground at this hour as we anticipate that meeting of the National Working Committee and all this talk of pickets for pro-Zuma supporters.
Well, Jen, it's business as usual outside Luthuli House, as the business as usual as it usually is on a Monday, which of course is always a busy day in and around this precinct, the headquarters of the ANC, because every Monday, of course, the top leadership of the ANC meets in either the top 6 leadership or every second week the National Working Committee. Of course, today is rather extraordinary in that a meeting of the National Working Committee, which also met last week, was actually called to sort of receive a report back from the meeting that was held by the national officials, the top 6 leaders with President Jacob Zuma last night. In as far as the protests are concerned, the latest word we have from the hands-off Zuma campaign is that they will be gathering at Gandhi Square at around 10 o'clock. In fact, one of the organizers that we spoke to, Mr. Ndusi, Dr. Ndusi, telling us that actually it's not going to be a big march. Of course, you'll know that there have been calls for ANC supporters to gather here as well to sort of counter that march by the hands-off Zuma campaign, and there have been harsh words directed at that campaign, which says they are defending President Jacob Zuma because they feel he's being targeted for championing radical economic transformation. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all pans out, but at this point no sight of any of the two sides, any of the two groups outside Luthuli House. I'm joined by analyst Khaya Sithole, who is with me this morning. Khaya, thank you so much for joining me. So last night President Jacob Zuma meets the top 6 of the ANC. We don't have definitive word of what happened, but at this point there's no indication that there's a resignation forthcoming. Are you surprised by this?
Not at all. I think what is probably more surprising is that you get the impression that the top 6 didn't actually know how to react to that, because for them to be calling an emergency National Working Committee meeting, it means that they actually had this idea that they would go to the president, offer him, this idea of a resignation, and he'd entertain it. So of course they should have been able to craft as early as last week to say, well, if the answer is no, this is how we're going to react to it. So for them to call an emergency meeting right now implies a sense of panic. It really gives the impression that they had a particular expectation, and of course the president didn't live up to it. I'm not particularly surprised that he's not going to resign, because I think what we are missing here is that unlike 10 years ago, there are a lot of personal culpability issues associated with the president vacating office. He will no longer be able to control particular issues. For example, the terms of reference for the state capture inquiry can only be amended by a sitting president. So of course for him, because it affects him directly and implicates him directly, he wants to at least hold on to the powers of the presidency for as long as he can, and until there is a constitutional way that leaves him no choice but to vacate office, he's free to ignore all the political conversations. So this one of the NEC itself, the NWC, and even the top 6, those are more political rather than legal conversations. He's completely within his rights to ignore them and say, I'll take my chances in parliament, whether through a vote of no confidence or even through a motion of impeachment, and I suspect that's where this is going to lead us.
But also, Khaya, the top 6 officials naturally would have had to come back and report to the National Working Committee, which in turn reports to the National Executive Committee. Given what we are speculating at this point about the resignation not being forthcoming, how likely now is this scenario of the NEC, the highest decision-making body, having to do that move that they've been trying to avoid of a recall?
I think they are gravitating towards that, and you suspect that perhaps even in the conversation yesterday, the president did say, well, if these particular concessions are made, I may entertain it. So perhaps they'll firstly feedback that into the National Working Committee to say, well, the conversation was not just an outright no. He said this is no for these particular reasons. How are we going to react to those? And I suspect once that conversation has been had, then they will decide that, look, this is beyond the scope of what we've been mandated to do by the National Executive Committee. So let us call them back into the room and say, this is what the president has said. We now don't know how to proceed. And of course, the NEC is then the one that has the ability to initiate what is a political process, of course, the idea of a recall. Again, even that recall, the president doesn't have to entertain it because it's an internal ANC process. And what they will simply say is that, look, we've lost faith in you as our deployee. But of course, you can say, well, that's fine. I don't know if National Assembly is going to share the same sentiments. Of course, when you get to National Assembly, then it's a secondary conversation, because then the caucus would have to be sort of persuaded to say, if a motion of no confidence is raised, you must then vote against the president. So you sort of have to follow all the steps. It's not a matter of simply saying president must go and the president must react to it. It's far more complicated than that.
Final question, Khaya, for now. Where are President Jacob Zuma's defenders? I mean, we're sitting here with a situation where the loudest voices are coming from the National Unemployed People's Trust, the National Funeral Practitioners Association, Black First, Land First. Where is the Youth League, the Women's League, and the likes, the MKMVA? Of course, the two leagues, the three leagues have representation inside the National Working Committee. But where is their voice in this matter?
Well, Thulasizwe, regardless of what the current situation is, President Jacob Zuma does have a limited lifespan now, because even if he completes his term, he will only be in power until April 2019. So, of course, those particular structures that have been vocal in supporting him now have to start thinking beyond 2019 and saying, well, if we become vocal now, when clearly the tide and the mood and the sentiment has turned against the president, what is the implication for us in the long run? So even though they might still support Zuma in principle, they are not going to come out and say it out loud, because now suddenly people start looking at them and saying, well, perhaps in the way political games are played, you'll feel the wrath of your actions later on beyond 2019. Cabinet positions are under consideration, deployments are under consideration, so they'll rather retreat and not say much, even though they might not have necessarily turned against President Jacob Zuma. You simply don't want to be sticking your head out and say, we must defend this man at all costs, when clearly the mood across the ground and within the party has turned against him.
What a time to be alive. Thank you so much, Khaya Sithole. Of course, as he is speaking there, Dan, I'm reminded of the MKMVA's Kebby Mapats were asked a question by Samgele Masego, being absolutely clear that, as MKMVA, they will be guided by whatever decision the ANC takes on the matter of President Jacob Zuma. Rewind a few months ago, I suspect he would have given a very different answer. So it's going to be very interesting. That meeting, of course, of the NWC scheduled to get underway at 2 p.m.
Thank you very much. That's ENC's Thulasizwe Simelane outside Luthuli House. Now